The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in a golden glow that painted the trees with an ethereal light. Ethan stood at the edge of his campsite, surveying the expanse of nature that stretched out before him. The stillness of the forest wrapped around him like a blanket, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. He had always loved this quiet, this solitude. It was the kind of peace that felt like it had been waiting for him, as though the wilderness itself had opened its arms and welcomed him. He was miles away from civilization, tucked deep into a remote stretch of wilderness. His tent had been set up beside a small clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees that towered over him like silent guardians. The evening breeze carried the faint smell of pine and earth, a scent that felt both grounding and freeing. Ethan had been hiking for days, traversing mountains and valleys, and today, he had found the perfect spot to rest. He had always felt more at home in nature than in the chaos of the world around him. Here, there were no deadlines, no expectations, no judgments, just him and the open sky. As the last slivers of sunlight faded from the sky, he stoked the campfire, watching the flames dance and flicker. The warmth was comforting, and he pulled his jacket tighter around himself. He had set up a small cooking pot on the fire, and the smell of his simple meal filled the air. Nothing fancy, just beans and rice, but it was enough. The fire crackled, and Ethan sighed contentedly, feeling a sense of deep satisfaction. There was a serenity in these moments, a quiet peace that came from being alone with nature. Ethan pulled out his journal from his backpack, flipping through the pages filled with notes about his hikes, sketches of the landscapes, and musings about life. It wasn't the first time he had come to this spot, but every time he returned, it felt like he was rediscovering it all over again. The wilderness had a way of making him feel alive in a way that nothing else could. He wasn't thinking about his job or his responsibilities back home. He was simply existing in the moment, fully immersed in the present. The fire crackled again, and Ethan leaned back against a tree, gazing up at the sky. The stars were beginning to appear, dotting the sky in brilliant white points of light. He marveled at their beauty, feeling a sense of awe wash over him. The vastness of the universe, the way the stars stretched endlessly into the unknown, made him feel small, but in a way that was comforting. It reminded him that the world was much bigger than his problems, bigger than his concerns. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the forest soothe him, the rustling of the trees, the occasional chirp of a cricket, the distant hoot of an owl. He was lost in the rhythm of nature, in the simple act of breathing and being. But then, something broke the stillness. A noise in the distance, faint at first, but unmistakable. A snap of a twig. Ethan's eyes snapped open, and his heart skipped a beat. He sat up straighter, his senses immediately on alert. The forest around him had fallen silent, an eerie calm settling over the campsite. It wasn't the first time he had heard noises at night in the wilderness. Deer, foxes, raccoons, all creatures of the forest. But this felt different. There was something about it, a heaviness in the air that made his skin crawl. He strained his ears, trying to identify the sound. It was distant, but it wasn't the usual rustling of small animals. This was something larger, something heavier. Ethan stood up slowly, his muscles tensed. His first instinct was to grab his flashlight, but he hesitated. Whatever it was still far enough away that the light might not be necessary yet. But his curiosity got the better of him. He reached for his flashlight and switched it on, scanning the surrounding woods with its beam. The light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees, shadows, and the occasional flicker of movement in the underbrush. But nothing stood out. His mind raced as he tried to rationalize what he had heard. Perhaps it was just a large animal, a bear maybe. There were bears in these parts, and while they weren't usually dangerous, they could still be a threat if provoked. But there was no immediate sign of danger. The last thing he wanted was to startle a bear into attacking, so he decided to stay calm. He took a deep breath, calming his racing thoughts. It was probably nothing, just the wilderness playing its usual tricks. He slowly sat back down by the fire, keeping his flashlight in his lap. The sounds of the forest had returned, the chirping of insects and the soft rustling of the trees. But just as he was beginning to relax again, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of something large moving through the brush. Much closer now. The rustling grew louder, and his heart rate quickened. Ethan's body stiffened, and his grip tightened on the flashlight. This time it was different. This wasn't just an animal wandering through the woods. This was something deliberate, something big, something predatory. Ethan slowly stood up again, his mind racing. His eyes scanned the darkness, his flashlight darting across the clearing. And then, suddenly, his beam caught something in the distance. Pair of eyes. Reflective, like two pale lights in the darkness, staring directly at him. His breath caught in his throat. There, in the shadows, stood a massive bear. Its dark form was partially obscured by the trees, but its eyes shone in the light, locked on Ethan with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and his breath became shallow. The bear didn't make a sound. It simply stared at him. Ethan could feel its gaze piercing through him, as if the animal was studying him, weighing him. Ethan had encountered bears before on his hikes, but they were always in the distance, never this close. He had always been taught to remain calm and avoid eye contact with wild animals. But the sheer size of the bear, the way it loomed just beyond the light of his fire, made it impossible to look away. His mind raced, his thoughts jumbled. He could hear his survival instincts kicking in. Stay still, don't make any sudden movements, slowly back away if it gets too close. But his body was frozen, as if the bear's gaze had paralyzed him. He couldn't think. He couldn't move. He could only watch as the bear took a few cautious steps forward, its massive paws sinking into the earth with each movement. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The bear was coming closer. Ethan's breath caught in his chest as the bear's massive frame moved closer, its heavy paws making almost no sound on the forest floor. The only sound now was his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears, the fire's crackling rhythm interrupted by the sharp intake of his breath. He wanted to move, to run, to do anything but stand there frozen like prey to this creature of raw, primal power. But he knew better. Running would trigger the chase. Sudden movements might provoke an attack. In the stillness, he dared not even blink. The bear's eyes never wavered. The two of them were locked in an unspoken standoff, neither daring to make the first move. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to remember everything he had learned about bear encounters. Stay calm. Make yourself appear bigger. But how? How could he possibly seem intimidating to a creature that outweighed him by hundreds of pounds, with claws that could rip through the toughest of tree trunks? The bear was simply too large, too wild for him to command in any way. The hiker's instincts screamed at him to do something, anything, but his limbs felt heavy, as though some invisible force was holding him in place. His flashlight was still clutched tightly in his hand, but the beam quivered with his fear, casting wild, unsteady shadows across the trees. He tried to steady it, focusing on the animal in front of him. The bear's fur was thick and dark, and though it wasn't charging, the low rumble emanating from deep within its chest sent a sharp pang of panic through Ethan's core. It was as if the bear were sizing him up, considering him as little more than a possibility for dinner. Sweat beaded on Ethan's brow, trickling down his temples and into his eyes, blurring his vision. The cold night air, previously soothing, now felt sharp against his skin. The warmth from the fire seemed to dissipate, the heat of the flames no match for the mounting tension. His throat felt dry, every breath more difficult than the last. He had been on countless hikes, trekked through the wilds of mountains and forests, but this was different. This wasn't a trail or a mountain to conquer. This was raw, unyielding nature, and he was its prey. The bear took another step forward, its massive form moving slowly, deliberately. Ethan's eyes never left the creature, watching its every movement, every shift in its weight. Its paws were huge, claws long and curved, the kind of weapons that could tear through his flesh in an instant. The thought was almost unbearable, and yet, it was the only one his mind could cling to in that moment. The air between them seemed to grow thicker, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan swallowed hard, fighting the rising panic in his chest. He had to stay calm. He knew this wasn't the moment to act recklessly, but the primal fear clawing at his gut urged him to do the opposite. His eyes flicked to his backpack, lying just a few feet away, and his hand twitched. He could grab his knife. He could use the bear spray, but would it be enough? He wasn't sure. He wasn't sure about anything anymore. "Think, Ethan," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible, swallowed by the immense silence around him. His words felt like a futile plea to himself. What could he do? Should he stand still? Should he try to scare it off? But how could he scare off a bear that was already this close? Every fiber of his being screamed at him to retreat, to escape, but every part of him knew that was out of the question now. The bear was too close. There was no retreating from it. The creature's massive head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were trying to understand him, trying to gauge whether he was a threat or simply something to ignore. Its dark eyes flicked down to the fire, then back to him, unblinking, unwavering. Ethan could see the deep scars across its muzzle, evidence of countless battles it had fought. Survival in the wild was no easy feat. The bear took another slow step forward, and this time, Ethan felt the ground beneath him vibrate ever so slightly with each heavy footfall. The hiker's muscles tensed, ready to spring into action at the slightest change in the bear's behavior. But the bear only stopped once more, standing still, as though it were waiting, observing, testing the air around them. Then, unexpectedly, the bear did something that sent a shockwave of confusion through Ethan's entire body. The creature dropped to all fours, its massive body lowering gently to the ground, almost in a seated position. Its head tilted again, its eyes never leaving the hikers. Ethan blinked, momentarily taken aback. What was it doing? Why wasn't it attacking? The fire crackled in the silence, the only sound now in the vastness of the wilderness. Ethan's breath slowed, his racing heart now keeping a cautious rhythm. The bear was not acting like a predator. It wasn't charging, it wasn't growling or showing its teeth. It was simply watching, waiting. Ethan took a small, tentative step backward, his eyes still fixed on the bear. He wasn't sure what to make of this behavior. Bears were unpredictable, yes, but they didn't normally behave like this, so still, so passive. It didn't make any sense. A soft rustling in the underbrush behind him made Ethan's stomach drop. Was it another bear? Or something worse? The sound was distant, but it was enough to send his pulse spiking again. The bear's head swiveled slightly toward the noise, its ears flicking. And then, just as quickly, it returned its attention to the hiker, its dark eyes scanning his every move. It was then that Ethan realized something. The bear wasn't just watching him, it was studying him. This wasn't the hungry, wild beast he had imagined, the one that would tear him apart without hesitation. This was something different, something almost curious. It was as if the bear was weighing him, testing him. But why? What did it want? The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end, the realization settling over him like a weight. Was the bear trying to communicate with him? No, that didn't make sense. Bears didn't communicate like humans. They didn't form connections. Yet there was something in the way it moved, in the way it sat there, that seemed to defy all logic. Ethan's mind raced. He had heard stories of unusual animal encounters, of seemingly intelligent creatures making unexpected decisions, but he had never believed them. Not until now. He couldn't explain it, but something deep within him told him that this was no ordinary bear encounter. This was something more. Suddenly, the bear made a soft noise, a low, rumbling growl that sounded more like a grumble of discontent than a threat. Ethan's heart lurched, but the bear's posture remained non-threatening, even relaxed. It wasn't showing signs of aggression. In fact, it almost seemed frustrated. The wind picked up again, and the trees began to sway, their branches creaking in the breeze. The fire flickered in response, casting a wobbly light over the campsite. Ethan turned his gaze back to the woods, his senses heightened, his every nerve on edge. For a moment, he felt like he was being watched again. The sensation was so intense that he couldn't help but glance nervously over his shoulder, half expecting to see the bear's dark silhouette standing at the edge of the clearing, waiting for him to slip up, waiting for him to make a mistake. His pulse quickened, and he resisted the urge to look over his shoulder again. The bear was gone. It had left him alive. That had to count for something. He tried to reassure himself, but the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach refused to go away. He had survived the night so far, but the wild had its own way of testing you, pushing you to your limits and beyond. "All right, stay focused," he whispered under his breath, attempting to anchor himself in the present. He was starting to feel more like a spectator in his own life, disconnected from the world around him, as if the events of the past few hours had pulled him out of reality and into some strange, surreal existence. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe it was the fear, or maybe it was something deeper, something more fundamental that had shifted in him. The crackling fire was his only anchor in the dark, and he found himself drawn to its warmth once again. The embers glowed brightly, their orange light flickering like tiny stars in the night. The fire, despite its warmth, felt distant. It wasn't the solace it used to be. Ethan stared into the flames, watching them flicker and dance, but all he could think about was the bear. The way it had studied him, the way it had watched him as if trying to understand him. What did it want? What did it know? The sudden screech of a bird in the distance broke Ethan's reverie, and he turned sharply, the tension in his shoulders suddenly returning. His eyes darted around the clearing again, his heart skipping in his chest. The night was alive with sounds now, each one making him more aware of how vulnerable he was out here in the wild. It wasn't just the bear anymore. It was the forest, the creatures, the unknown dangers lurking in the dark. And then, in a moment of sheer instinct, he realized something. The forest wasn't just silent anymore. It was alive. Every movement, every sound felt amplified now. The trees, the wind, the distant howls of wolves or coyotes, all of it seemed to be part of a larger, unseen orchestra. Ethan wasn't just in the forest anymore. He was part of it, inseparable from it. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. "Get a grip," he muttered, his voice rough and strained. He needed to shake off the feeling of being watched. He needed to regain control. But the unease was deepening, burrowing itself into his thoughts. The bear had shown him something about nature, about survival, that he wasn't sure he was ready to understand. Ethan stood up abruptly, a sense of urgency rushing through him. He had to do something, anything. He couldn't just sit here, feeling like prey in the middle of this vast, untamed wilderness. He grabbed his gear, packing away what little he could, making sure everything was secure in his backpack. His hands were trembling, and his mind was clouded with uncertainty. He had planned on staying the night, but something inside him told him he wasn't safe here anymore. Not just because of the bear, but because something about this place had changed for him. Maybe it was the bear's behavior. Maybe it was the overwhelming sense of vulnerability that had settled in his chest. Either way, the wild was no longer his safe place. It was something else. Something that, at this moment, he didn't quite understand. The crackling fire cast one last, long shadow across the campsite, and Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding in his ears. He couldn't stay here. He had to move. But where could he go? Ethan's mind raced as he stood there, his backpack slung over his shoulder, facing the path that led deeper into the wilderness. His fingers twitched with nervous energy, the bear's presence still looming in his thoughts. The wind had picked up again, but it seemed different this time, heavier, charged with an unknown force. The trees around him groaned, their branches swaying in rhythm with the wind, as if the forest itself was alive, aware of his hesitation. His instincts told him to leave, to put distance between himself and the encounter that had left him so unsettled. But something else tugged at him, a strange sense of duty, of connection, to the very wilderness he had always loved. The bear had watched him, studied him, not as a threat, but as part of the wild, a force that couldn't be understood through logic alone. He felt it in his bones now. The wild didn't care for the boundaries he had drawn between himself and nature. It didn't care for his comfort or his understanding. Simply was. He took a deep breath and began walking, each step carrying him further from his camp, from the fire, from the moment he had shared with the bear. The ground beneath his boots was soft and damp, the forest floor thick with pine needles. The deeper he went, the more the silence wrapped around him. And yet, it was a silence that felt alive, as if the forest was waiting for something, waiting for him. The tension in his chest didn't ease, but the urgency that had propelled him to pack up and leave seemed to dissipate. With each step, he found himself becoming more attuned to the world around him. The wind shifted again, this time carrying the faintest scent of something familiar, something human, yet not entirely. He stopped in his tracks, eyes narrowing, straining to listen. A rustling noise to his right, soft but persistent, caught his attention. His heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his throat. There, just beyond the trees, stood the bear. It wasn't the same imposing figure it had been earlier. This time, the bear was not staring at him with predatory eyes. Instead, it stood still, its massive form framed by the moonlight, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The bear's gaze was not filled with malice, but something else. It was as if the creature understood him now, understood his hesitation, his fear, and perhaps even his desire to escape. But it wasn't leaving. It was waiting just like before. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but the fear was different this time. It wasn't the terror that had paralyzed him earlier. It was something softer, something almost reverent. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do now, whether he was meant to run or stay. The silence stretched between them, both of them standing in the stillness of the forest, two beings connected by a shared understanding of the wild, yet divided by an insurmountable chasm of experience. Then, without warning, the bear took a step forward, its massive paw sinking into the earth with a soft thud. Ethan's breath hitched, his instincts screaming for him to move, to do something, but his body remained frozen. The bear's movements were slow, deliberate, almost curious. It took another step, then another, until it was standing only a few feet from him. Ethan could hear his heartbeat in his ears, and yet, the bear showed no sign of aggression. It wasn't until the bear was right in front of him that it did something unexpected. It lowered its massive head, nudging Ethan's pack gently with its snout. The contact was brief, but it sent a ripple of shock through his body. The bear's warm breath brushed against his hand, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan felt a strange bond, an undeniable connection to this wild creature. He stared at the bear, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. What was this? What was the bear trying to communicate? It wasn't the action of an animal driven by hunger or aggression. This was something else, something more intimate. The bear wasn't here to threaten him. It was here, perhaps, to remind him of the wild's power, of its unpredictability, of its strength. It wasn't just about survival. It was about understanding the balance that existed between all living things. And then, just as quietly as it had appeared, the bear pulled away, retreating back into the shadows of the forest. Ethan stood there, his mind reeling, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. The bear was gone, vanishing into the night, leaving only the sound of the wind and the soft rustle of leaves behind. For a long moment, Ethan stood still, his body tense, his mind racing. He didn't know what to make of it. He didn't know what had just happened, or why the bear had behaved in the way it did. But as the silence of the forest settled around him, one thing was clear. The wilderness was not a place for logic or reason. It was a place of raw power, a force that could not be tamed or understood. The bear had shown him that. Ethan turned slowly, looking back toward the path he had been following. He could continue his journey, continue down the trail that would take him further into the wilderness, further away from the world he knew. But for the first time, he wasn't sure where he was headed. The wild, in all its unpredictable glory, had shifted something in him. It had broken the boundaries he had set, torn down the walls between man and nature. With one last glance at the place where the bear had disappeared, Ethan took a deep breath and began walking again, the path stretching out before him, unknown and full of possibility. He didn't know what the future held, what the wilderness would teach him next, but he knew this much. He would never see the wild the same way again. The forest seemed to breathe with him now, alive and vibrant, full of secrets yet to be uncovered. The journey was far from over, and somewhere, deep within the trees, the bear watched him go.